The autumn rain drummed against the tall windows of Raven's Hollow Castle as Lady Isabella Thornfield walked slowly through the dimly lit corridors. Her black mourning dress rustled against the cold stone floor, and her emerald eyes were still red from the tears she had shed at yesterday's funeral. Duke Edmund Ravenshollow, the man who had been like a grandfather to her, was gone forever. Isabella had grown up in these very halls after her parents died in a carriage accident when she was only 7 years old. Duke Edmund had taken her in without hesitation, raising her alongside his own grandson, Prince Alexander. The Duke had been the kindest man she had ever known, always treating her not as a ward or charity case, but as true family. Now, at 25, Isabella served as the castle's head of charitable works, organizing aid for the local villages and managing the Duke's extensive philanthropy programs. She had never married, despite numerous suitors, preferring to dedicate her life to helping others just as the Duke had taught her. The great library doors stood open, and Isabella could hear voices coming from within. She paused, recognizing the sharp tone of Duchess Victoria Ravenshollow, Prince Alexander's stepmother who had married into the family 5 years ago. The Duchess had never liked Isabella, viewing her as an outsider who had somehow wormed her way into the family's good graces and fortune. "This is absolutely ridiculous," Duchess Victoria was saying, her voice rising with anger. "How could Father Edmund have been so foolish? Isabella is not even blood family." Isabella's heart sank. They were clearly discussing something about Duke Edmund's will, and from the sound of it, she was somehow involved. She knew she should announce her presence or walk away, but something kept her frozen in place. "The will is perfectly legal, Victoria," came the calm voice of Mr. Pemberton, the family's longtime solicitor. "His Grace was of sound mind when he made these arrangements, and I witnessed the signing myself along with 2 other independent witnesses. But she's nothing but a charity case." Duchess Victoria Spot. Edmund took pity on a little orphan girl, and now she stands to inherit more than Alexander's own stepmother? It's not right. Isabella pressed her hand to her mouth, shocked. What inheritance could they possibly be talking about? Duke Edmund had always been generous with her, paying for her education and providing her with a comfortable life, but she had never expected anything more. "If I may continue reading the will," Mr. Pemberton said diplomatically. His Grace was very specific about his wishes regarding Lady Isabella. There was a rustling of papers, and then Mr. Pemberton's clear voice continued. "To my beloved Isabella, who brought light and joy back into these halls when I thought all hope was lost, I leave the entirety of the Ravenshollow Foundation, including all its assets, properties, and endowments, valued at approximately £12 million. I also bequeath to her the Rose Cottage estate and its surrounding lands, as well as the family's collection of rare books and manuscripts." Isabella gasped softly, then quickly covered her mouth again. £12 million? The Rose Cottage estate? These were staggering gifts that she had never in her wildest dreams imagined receiving. Furthermore, Mr. Pemberton continued, "I name Lady Isabella Thornfield as the primary executor of all my charitable works and foundations. She has proven herself to be compassionate, intelligent, and dedicated to helping others. I trust her judgment completely in continuing my legacy of service to those less fortunate." This is insanity. Duchess Victoria Svikith. Alexander, say something. This woman is stealing your inheritance. Isabella heard Prince Alexander's deep voice for the first time since she had been standing there. "Isabella has been part of this family longer than you have, Victoria. If grandfather wanted her to have these things, then I respect his wishes. She's earned every bit of it through years of dedication and kindness." "You cannot be serious," Duchess Victoria said, her voice dripping with disdain. "She's manipulated a dying old man into giving away the family fortune. Mark my words, Alexander, if you don't contest this will, you'll regret it for the rest of your life." Isabella could bear to hear no more. Her heart was pounding as she turned and hurried away from the library, her mind reeling from what she had just learned. The Duke had left her a fortune, but, more importantly, he had entrusted her with continuing his life's work of helping others. It was an honor beyond anything she could have imagined, but she could already see that it would come with a price. As she made her way to her chambers, Isabella passed several servants who bowed respectfully. She had always been kind to the staff, remembering what it felt like to feel displaced and uncertain. Now she wondered how they would treat her once word of the inheritance spread throughout the castle. Her room was a comfort, filled with books the Duke had given her over the years and watercolor paintings she had created of the castle gardens. Isabella sat heavily on her bed, trying to process everything she had heard. The Duke had essentially made her one of the wealthiest women in the kingdom, but more than that, he had given her the power to help thousands of people through his charitable foundations. There was a soft knock at her door, and Isabella called for whoever it was to enter. To her surprise, Prince Alexander stepped into the room. At 30 years old, he was tall and handsome, with dark hair and kind brown eyes that reminded her so much of his grandfather. He had always been like a brother to her, protecting her when they were children and supporting her work as they grew older. "I thought you might want to know what was in the will," Alexander said gently, closing the door behind him. "But I suspect you may have already heard some of it." Isabella blushed, realizing she had been caught eavesdropping. "I didn't mean to listen, but I heard voices and—" "It's all right," Alexander said with a small smile. "It concerns you, after all. Grandfather loved you very much, Isabella. He used to tell me that you reminded him of my grandmother, especially your compassion for others." "I never expected anything like this," Isabella said softly. "The responsibility feels overwhelming. What if I'm not worthy of his trust?" Alexander sat down in the chair across from her bed, leaning forward earnestly. "Isabella, you've been preparing for this your entire life without even knowing it. Every time you organized food for struggling families, every time you visited the sick in the village, every time you fought for better conditions for the workers, you were showing grandfather exactly why he could trust you with his legacy. But your stepmother is right about one thing," Isabella said, wrapping her arms around herself. "I'm not really family. I'm just someone your grandfather took pity on." "Don't ever say that again," Alexander said firmly. "Family isn't just about blood, Isabella. You've been my sister in every way that matters since the day you arrived here. Grandfather didn't leave you that inheritance out of pity. He left it to you because he knew you would use it to continue his work and help people who need it most." Isabella felt tears welling up in her eyes again. "Victoria will never accept this. She'll make life here impossible for me." Alexander's expression darkened. "Victoria's opinion doesn't matter. This is still my family's home, and you will always be welcome here. Besides, once the inheritance is settled, you'll have your own estate at Rose Cottage. You could live independently if you choose to." "I've never lived anywhere but Raven's Hollow," Isabella said quietly. "This castle has been my whole world, and it always will be," Alexander assured her. "But now you'll have options. You'll have the freedom to do whatever you think is best for the foundations and for yourself." They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, both lost in thought about how dramatically their lives had just changed. Finally, Isabella spoke up. "What did your grandfather leave to you? I hope this doesn't mean you'll struggle financially." Alexander chuckled. "Don't worry about me. I inherited the title, the castle, most of the traditional lands, and more than enough money to live comfortably. Grandfather was very strategic about how he divided things. He knew I would be fine with the duchy itself, and he knew you were the right person to carry on his charitable work. And Victoria? She received a generous settlement, though clearly not as much as she expected. But she married into this family knowing that most of the estate would pass to blood relatives, and those grandfather specifically chose to honor." Isabella nodded, trying to imagine what her new life would look like. The responsibility was daunting, but she was also excited about the possibility of expanding the Duke's charitable work and helping even more people. There's something else, Alexander said hesitantly. Something Victoria doesn't know yet, and something I think you should be prepared for. Isabella looked up at him with concern. What is it? Grandfather included a very specific clause in his will about you. He wrote that if anyone attempts to contest your inheritance or make your life difficult because of it, their own inheritance will be forfeited entirely. Isabella's eyes widened. He protected me even after his death. He knew exactly what kind of person Victoria is, Alexander said grimly. He wanted to make sure you could focus on your work without constantly having to defend your right to do it. But won't that just make her angrier? Probably, Alexander admitted. But it also means she can't act on that anger without serious consequences. Grandfather was many things, but he was not naive about human nature. As if summoned by their conversation, there was a sharp knock at Isabella's door. Without waiting for permission, Duchess Victoria swept into the room, her face flushed with anger and her blonde hair slightly disheveled. I should have known I'd find you here, Alexander, she said coldly. Already plotting with your little protégé about how to spend the family fortune? Victoria, that's enough, Alexander said, standing up to face his stepmother. Isabella has done nothing wrong, and she deserves to be treated with respect in this house. Respect. Victoria laughed bitterly. For someone who has manipulated her way into a fortune she never earned? I don't think so. Isabella stood up as well, her spine straight, and her voice steady despite her racing heart. Your Grace, I understand that you're upset about the will, but I had no knowledge of what Duke Edmund planned to leave me. I would never have tried to influence his decisions. Oh, how convenient, Victoria sneered. The innocent little orphan who just happened to charm her way into 12 million pounds. Do you really expect me to believe you had no idea? Whether you believe it or not doesn't change the facts, Isabella replied calmly. I love Duke Edmund like a grandfather, and I will honor his memory by using his gifts to help others, just as he would have wanted. Victoria's eyes flashed dangerously. We'll see about that. This can be contested, and I intend to prove that you manipulated a grieving old man into giving away his family's birthright. Actually, you can't, Alexander said quietly. And if you try, you'll lose everything grandfather left you. Victoria turned to stare at her stepson. What are you talking about? There's a clause in the will that specifically addresses attempts to contest Isabella's inheritance, Alexander explained. Any beneficiary who challenges her bequest will forfeit their own inheritance entirely. The color drained from Victoria's face as the implication sank in. She looked back and forth between Alexander and Isabella, clearly calculating her options. This is all you're doing, she finally said, pointing an accusatory finger at Isabella. You've turned this entire family against me. I've done nothing but try to live quietly and help others, Isabella said firmly. If you choose to see that as a threat, that's your decision, but I won't apologize for trying to honor Duke Edmund's memory. Victoria stared at her for a long moment, her face a mask of barely controlled rage. Finally, she turned on her heel and stalked toward the door. This isn't over, she said coldly before slamming the door behind her. Isabella sank back down onto her bed, her hands shaking slightly. I'm afraid she's right. This isn't over. What kind of life am I going to have here now? Alexander sat back down and took her hands in his. You're going to have the life you choose to have, Isabella. You have resources now and independence. You don't have to let anyone make you feel small or unwelcome ever again. But I never wanted wealth for its own sake, Isabella said softly. I just wanted to belong somewhere and help people. And now you can help more people than ever before, Alexander pointed out. Grandfather saw something special in you, Isabella. Trust in his judgment and trust in yourself. As the evening shadows lengthened across her room, Isabella looked out at the castle grounds where she had played as a child and worked as a young woman. Everything was about to change, but perhaps change didn't have to mean loss. Perhaps it could mean the beginning of something even more meaningful than what she was leaving behind. 3 weeks had passed since the reading of Duke Edmund's will, and the atmosphere at Raven's Hollow Castle had grown increasingly tense. Isabella had tried to maintain her normal routines, continuing to oversee the charitable works and manage the household's philanthropic activities, but she could feel the weight of suspicious glances and whispered conversations following her wherever she went. The servants, who had once treated her with warm familiarity, now seemed uncertain how to behave around her. Some bowed more deeply than before, clearly aware of her new status, while others appeared distant and cold. Isabella suspected that Duchess Victoria had been spreading poison in their ears, painting her as a manipulative fortune hunter who had deceived their beloved master. This morning, Isabella sat in the estate office that Duke Edmund had used for managing his charitable foundations. The room was lined with ledgers documenting decades of good works, schools built in poor villages, medical clinics established in remote areas, scholarships provided to deserving students, and countless other acts of generosity. The responsibility of continuing this legacy felt both inspiring and overwhelming. Mr. Pemberton, the family solicitor, had scheduled a meeting to go over the details of transferring the foundation's assets to Isabella's control. As she waited for him to arrive, she reviewed the financial documents that showed the true scope of what she had inherited. The Ravens Hollow Foundation wasn't just wealthy. It was one of the largest charitable organizations in the kingdom, with interests in education, healthcare, housing, and agricultural development. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts, and Mr. Pemberton entered carrying a leather briefcase stuffed with legal documents. He was an elderly gentleman with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, and he had been managing the Ravens Hollow family's legal affairs for over 30 years. "Good morning, Lady Isabella," he said warmly, settling into the chair across from her desk. "I trust you've been well despite these difficult circumstances?" "As well as can be expected, thank you," Isabella replied diplomatically. She had learned to be careful with her words since the will reading, knowing that anything she said might be twisted and used against her. "Excellent. Now, we have quite a bit to cover today regarding the transfer of assets and your new responsibilities." Mr. Pemberton opened his briefcase and began pulling out folders. "The good news is that Duke Edmund was extraordinarily thorough in his planning. He's made the transition as smooth as possible for you. I have to ask," Isabella said hesitantly, "is there any legal way for the inheritance to be challenged? Duchess Victoria seems convinced that she can overturn the will." Mr. Pemberton's expression grew serious. "I've been expecting this question. The short answer is no, not successfully. Duke Edmund's will is ironclad from a legal standpoint. He was examined by 3 different physicians in the months before his death, all of whom certified that he was of sound mind. The will was witnessed properly, and the language is unambiguous. But she could still try. She could file a legal challenge." "Yes," Mr. Pemberton admitted. "However, doing so would trigger the forfeiture clause, and she would lose her own inheritance entirely. It would be a very foolish gamble with very little chance of success." Isabella felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. At least she wouldn't have to fight a legal battle on top of everything else she was dealing with. "Now, then," Mr. Pemberton continued, "let's discuss the practical aspects of your new position. The Foundation currently employs 47 people across its various programs. You'll need to meet with each department head to understand their current projects and future plans." For the next 2 hours, they went through budgets, investment portfolios, and operational procedures. Isabella was amazed by the complexity of the organization she now controlled. There were schools in 7 different counties, medical clinics in remote mountain villages, job training programs for unemployed workers, and agricultural research projects aimed at helping farmers increase their yields. Duke Edmund was particularly passionate about education, Mr. Pemberton explained as they reviewed the scholarship programs. He believed that knowledge was the key to lifting people out of poverty permanently. "I share that belief," Isabella said, making notes as they talked. "I'd like to expand the scholarship program if the finances allow it." "They definitely do," Mr. Pemberton assured her. The foundation's investments have been performing very well, and you have considerable resources available for new initiatives. As their meeting was concluding, there was another knock at the door. This time it was Prince Alexander, looking somewhat harried and concerned. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, "but I thought you should know that Victoria has been receiving visitors this morning. Lady Margaret Blackstone and Lord Reginald Fairfax arrived about an hour ago." Isabella exchanged glances with Mr. Pemberton. Lady Margaret was known throughout the kingdom as a vindictive gossip who delighted in spreading scandal, while Lord Reginald was a bitter man who had lost most of his own fortune through poor investments and gambling. "I see," Mr. Pemberton said carefully. "And do we know the purpose of their visit?" "They're old friends of Victoria's, and they've never had any love for our family," Alexander explained. "Margaret in particular has always resented our wealth and influence. I suspect Victoria is trying to rally support for some kind of campaign against Isabella." Isabella felt her heart sink. "What kind of campaign?" "Probably attempting to damage your reputation publicly," Alexander said grimly. "If she can't challenge the will legally, she might try to make you so uncomfortable that you give up the inheritance voluntarily." "That's diabolical," Isabella breathed. "Welcome to aristocratic politics," Alexander said dryly. "Victoria has never been content to lose gracefully at anything." Mr. Pemberton cleared his throat diplomatically. "If I may make a suggestion, Lady Isabella, it might be wise for you to begin establishing your own social connections independent of Ravenshollow Castle. As the head of a major charitable foundation, you'll have automatic entry into the highest levels of society. Building alliances now could protect you from whatever schemes Duchess Victoria might be planning." "But I've never been comfortable with social politics," Isabella protested. "I prefer working directly with people who need help rather than attending fancy parties and making small talk." "I understand," Mr. Pemberton said kindly, "but unfortunately, much of charitable work at this level involves convincing wealthy people to support your causes. You'll need to learn to navigate society events and cultivate relationships with other philanthropists." Alexander nodded in agreement. "He's right, Isabella, and I'll help you however I can. My position as Duke gives me access to everyone important in the kingdom." Over the following days, Isabella threw herself into learning about every aspect of the Foundation's operations. She visited schools, toured medical clinics, and met with program directors. Everywhere she went, she was impressed by the quality of the work being done in Duke Edmund's name. Teachers spoke passionately about their students' progress. Doctors described how the clinics had transformed healthcare in their regions, and village leaders expressed deep gratitude for the Foundation's support. But she also began to notice subtle signs that Duchess Victoria's campaign against her was having an effect. At a school opening ceremony, several prominent donors who had been expected to attend sent last-minute regrets. During a Foundation board meeting, some members seemed cooler toward her than they had been just a week earlier. The breaking point came when Isabella attended her first major social event as the head of the Foundation, a charity gala hosted by the Marchioness of Westmore. Isabella had spent days preparing, working with a seamstress to create an appropriate gown, and studying the guest list to understand who would be attending. The gala was held in the Marchioness's magnificent ballroom, with crystal chandeliers casting warm light over hundreds of guests dressed in their finest attire. Isabella arrived with Prince Alexander as her escort, hoping his presence would help smooth any social difficulties. At first, the evening seemed to be going well. Several Foundation donors approached Isabella to congratulate her on her new role and express confidence in her leadership. She began to relax, thinking that perhaps Duchess Victoria's efforts to undermine her hadn't been as effective as feared. Then, Lady Margaret Blackstone appeared at Isabella's side during a quiet moment when Alexander had stepped away to speak with other guests. "My dear Isabella," Lady Margaret said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "how lovely to see you here. Though I must say, some people are quite surprised by your sudden elevation to such an important position." "I'm honored by Duke Edmund's confidence in me," Isabella replied carefully. "Oh yes, of course," Lady Margaret continued, her voice dripping with false sweetness. Though one does have to wonder about the circumstances that led to such generous bequests. It's quite unusual for non-family members to inherit such vast sums, don't you think? Isabella felt heat rising in her cheeks, but she kept her voice steady. Duke Edmund was like family to me. I've lived at Ravenshollow Castle since I was 7 years old. Exactly, Lady Margaret exclaimed, as if Isabella had just proven her point. All those years in such close proximity to a lonely widower. One can certainly understand how a young woman might develop, shall we say, significant influence over an elderly gentleman's decisions. The implication was clear and disgusting. Lady Margaret was suggesting that Isabella had manipulated Duke Edmund through some kind of inappropriate relationship. Isabella felt sick to her stomach, but she knew that reacting angrily would only make things worse. Duke Edmund was a man of great wisdom and integrity, Isabella said firmly. His decisions reflected his own values and priorities, not anyone else's influence. Of course, dear, Lady Margaret said with another false smile, though I'm sure you can understand why some people might have questions. After all, £12 million is quite a lot of money for a simple act of charity toward an orphan. Before Isabella could respond, she heard Prince Alexander's voice behind her. Lady Margaret, he said coldly, I couldn't help but overhear your conversation. I hope you're not suggesting anything improper about my grandfather's character or Lady Isabella's conduct. Lady Margaret's smile faltered slightly. Your Grace, I was simply making conversation about the unusual nature of the bequest. Surely you can understand people's curiosity. What I understand, Alexander said, his voice carrying the authority of his ducal title, is that my grandfather was one of the most honorable men in the kingdom, and Lady Isabella has been a beloved member of our family for nearly 2 decades. Anyone who suggests otherwise is questioning both his judgment and her character, which I find deeply offensive. Lady Margaret took a step back, clearly not expecting such a direct confrontation. I meant no offense, Your Grace. You were simply spreading malicious gossip, Alexander interrupted. I suggest you find other topics of conversation for the remainder of the evening. Lady Margaret hurried away, but Isabella knew the damage had been done. She could already see other guests watching them with curious expressions, and she was certain that Lady Margaret's insinuations would spread through the ballroom like wildfire. I think I should leave, Isabella said quietly to Alexander. Absolutely not, he replied firmly. Running away now will only make it look like you have something to hide. We're going to stay here, hold our heads high, and show everyone that we have nothing to be ashamed of. For the rest of the evening, Alexander remained close by Isabella's side, making it clear to everyone that he supported her completely. Several other guests approached to offer their own congratulations and express admiration for her work with the foundation. But Isabella could also feel the weight of suspicious glances and hushed conversations. On the carriage ride back to Ravenshollow Castle, Isabella finally allowed herself to show how upset she was. This is impossible, she said, tears streaming down her face. How can I do my work if people think I'm some kind of scheming seductress who manipulated your grandfather? Most people don't think that, Alexander assured her. Margaret Blackstone is known for her vicious tongue and her jealousy of anyone more successful than herself. The people who matter will judge you by your actions, not by her gossip. But what if they don't? What if this ruins the foundation's reputation? I can't bear the thought that Duke Edmund's legacy might be damaged because of me. Alexander was quiet for a moment, then took her hand gently. Isabella, I need to tell you something that might help you understand why grandfather chose you for this responsibility. Isabella looked at him through her tears. What do you mean? He knew this would happen, Alexander said softly. He knew that giving you such a large inheritance would create jealousy and suspicion. He talked to me about it before he died. He knew people would think badly of me. He knew that some people would try to tear you down because of your success, Alexander explained. But he also knew that you were strong enough to withstand it and wise enough to stay focused on what really mattered, helping people who need it. He said all of this to you? Alexander nodded. He told me that true character is revealed not when everything is easy, but when people face adversity and challenge. He said you had already proven your character through years of quiet service, and now you would have the chance to prove it again on a larger stage. Isabella wiped away her tears, feeling a spark of her old determination returning. So, this is just the beginning? I'm afraid so, Alexander said honestly. Victoria and her allies aren't going to give up easily. But you have allies too, and more importantly, you have the truth on your side. As their carriage approached Raven's Hollow Castle, Isabella straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin. Duke Edmund had entrusted her with continuing his life's work, and she wasn't going to let gossip and jealousy stop her from honoring that trust. The battle for her reputation and her right to carry on the Foundation's mission was just beginning, but she was ready to fight. 2 months had passed since the disastrous charity gala, and Isabella's life had become a carefully orchestrated battle between her determination to honor Duke Edmund's legacy and the relentless attacks on her character orchestrated by Duchess Victoria and her allies. What had started as whispered gossip at social events had escalated into a full-scale campaign designed to destroy Isabella's reputation and force her to abandon her inheritance. The morning started like many others recently, with Isabella reviewing correspondence in the Foundation office. But instead of the usual reports from field workers and thank you letters from beneficiaries, her desk was covered with newspaper clippings, all featuring headlines that made her stomach churn. Mystery Heiress. How did an orphan inherit millions? Read one from the kingdom's most widely circulated newspaper. Another proclaimed the Raven's Hollow scandal. Questions surround massive bequest to former ward. But the most painful was from a usually reputable publication. Duke Edmund's final mistake? Family friends question unusual will. Isabella picked up each article with trembling hands, reading the carefully worded insinuations that stopped just short of outright accusations. The journalist had clearly been fed information by someone with intimate knowledge of the family's private affairs, someone who had access to details that only a household member would know. The office door opened, and Prince Alexander entered carrying his own stack of newspapers. His face was grim, and Isabella could see the anger burning in his eyes. "I've just come from a meeting with my solicitor," he said without preamble. "These articles are clearly coordinated. Someone has been feeding information to multiple newspapers simultaneously." "Victoria," Isabella said quietly. It wasn't a question. Almost certainly, though she's been clever about covering her tracks. The stories are all attributed to family friends and society sources, but the level of detail suggests someone with direct access to household information. Isabella set down the newspapers and rubbed her temples, feeling a headache building. "What kind of information?" "Private details about your childhood here, specific amounts from the will that weren't supposed to be public knowledge, even details about grandfather's final weeks that only someone in the house would know." "She's really trying to destroy me," Isabella said, more in amazement than anger. "But why?" "The will can't be changed. What does she gain from this?" Alexander sat down across from her, his expression thoughtful. "I think she's hoping to make your life so miserable that you'll voluntarily give up the inheritance. If you renounce your claim, the assets would likely revert to the estate, which means they'd come under my control as the new duke. And she thinks she could manipulate you into giving her access to the Foundation's resources." "Probably. Victoria has always overestimated her influence over me." Alexander's voice carried a bitter edge. "She doesn't understand that I've been watching her machinations for years, and I have no intention of being her puppet." Isabella picked up another newspaper, this one featuring an article that made her heart sink even further. "Look at this one. It's questioning the Foundation's current management. It suggests that donations might be misappropriated under inexperienced leadership." Alexander read over her shoulder, his jaw tightening. "This is libel, pure and simple. We need to respond legally." "But that would just bring more attention to the whole situation," Isabella protested. "And it might make me look guilty of something." So what do you propose? Let them continue destroying your reputation without fighting back. Isabella was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the gardens where she had played as a child. Those had been simpler times, when the most complicated decision she faced was which book to read next or whether to help the cook with preparations for dinner. There's something else, Alexander said gently. Something you need to know before you decide how to handle this. Isabella looked back at him with concern. What now? I've received word that several major donors to the foundation are considering withdrawing their support. They're not saying it's because of the newspaper stories, but the timing is suspicious. Isabella felt like she'd been punched in the stomach. How many donors? 3 so far, but if this trend continues, it could seriously impact the foundation's ability to fund current programs. So Victoria is succeeding, Isabella said bitterly. Even if I keep the inheritance, I might not be able to use it effectively if no one will work with me. Don't give up yet, Alexander said firmly. We still have options. Before Isabella could ask what he meant, there was a knock at the office door. Mrs. Hartwell, the head housekeeper, entered looking distressed. Begging your pardon, Lady Isabella, but there's a situation you need to know about. What kind of situation? 3 of the housemaids have given notice this morning. They're saying, Mrs. Hartwell paused, clearly uncomfortable with what she had to relay. They're saying they don't feel comfortable working in a household where there might have been improper conduct. Isabella closed her eyes, feeling the last of her composure beginning to crumble. I see. That's not all, Mrs. Hartwell continued reluctantly. The cook's assistant and one of the footmen have also asked to be transferred to other positions within the duchy. They're not leaving entirely, but they don't want to work directly in the castle anymore. After Mrs. Hartwell left, Isabella and Alexander sat in heavy silence. The campaign against Isabella wasn't just damaging her reputation in society. It was beginning to tear apart the very household she had called home for most of her life. I can't do this anymore, Isabella said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I can't watch everything Duke Edmund built be destroyed because of me. Isabella, no, Alexander said urgently. You can't let them win. It's not about winning or losing anymore, Isabella replied, tears starting to flow down her cheeks. It's about protecting the foundation and its work. If my presence is hurting the people we're supposed to be helping, then maybe I should step aside. You would give up £12 million and everything you've worked for because of malicious gossip. I would give up anything to protect Duke Edmund's legacy, Isabella said firmly. The money was never the point, Alexander. The work is what matters. Alexander stood up and began pacing the room, clearly frustrated. There has to be another way. Some way to fight back that doesn't involve surrendering everything. As if summoned by their conversation, there was another knock at the door. This time, it was Mr. Pemberton, the family solicitor, looking more agitated than Isabella had ever seen him. Forgive the intrusion, he said, but I bring urgent news that affects Lady Isabella's situation. Please sit down, Isabella said wearily. What fresh disaster has occurred? Mr. Pemberton sat down and pulled out a letter from his briefcase. I've received a communication from Lord Reginald Fairfax's solicitor. He's threatening to file a formal complaint with the High Court challenging the validity of Duke Edmund's will. Isabella felt her blood turn to ice. But you said that was impossible. You said the will was ironclad. Legally, it is, Mr. Pemberton said quickly. But Fairfax isn't planning to challenge the will itself. He's threatening to petition the court to investigate whether Duke Edmund was subjected to undue influence during his final years. On what grounds? Alexander demanded. Apparently, Lady Margaret Blackstone has provided a sworn statement claiming she witnessed what she describes as inappropriately intimate behavior between Lady Isabella and Duke Edmund during a visit to the castle last year. Isabella gasped, her face going white. That's a complete lie. I was never inappropriate with Duke Edmund in any way. I believe you completely, Mr. Pemberton assured her. But the mere existence of such accusations, especially in the current climate of public suspicion, could tie up the inheritance in legal proceedings for years. Even though there's no truth to them, Unfortunately, yes. Court investigations of this nature can be extremely lengthy, and during that time, all assets would be frozen. The Foundation's work would be severely limited. Isabella stood up abruptly and walked to the window, her mind racing. Everything she had feared was coming to pass. Victoria and her allies weren't just trying to destroy Isabella's reputation. They were willing to damage the Foundation itself to get what they wanted. What would happen if I simply renounced the inheritance voluntarily? Isabella asked quietly. Isabella, don't even consider it, Alexander said sharply. No, I need to understand my options, Isabella insisted. Mr. Pemberton, what would happen to the Foundation if I stepped aside? The elderly solicitor looked uncomfortable. If you renounced your claim, the inheritance would likely revert to the primary estate, which would place it under Duke Alexander's control. And the clause about contesting the will? That would become irrelevant if you gave up your claim voluntarily. Duchess Victoria's inheritance would be secure. Isabella nodded slowly, the pieces of her decision falling into place. So if I step aside, the Foundation continues its work under Alexander's guidance. Victoria gets to keep her inheritance, and all this scandal dies away. At the cost of your own future and your rights, Alexander pointed out angrily. Isabella, grandfather chose you for a reason. Don't let these people intimidate you into giving up what you've earned. But look at what my keeping it has cost, Isabella said, gesturing to the newspapers scattered across her desk. The Foundation's reputation is being damaged. Donors are withdrawing support. And now there's going to be a court investigation that could tie everything up for years. There might be another way, Mr. Pemberton said hesitantly. Both Isabella and Alexander turned to look at him. What do you mean? Isabella asked. Duke Edmund included several contingency provisions in his will that we haven't discussed yet. He seemed to anticipate that you might face exactly this kind of challenge to your inheritance. What kind of contingencies? Alexander asked. Mr. Pemberton pulled out another document from his briefcase. He established what he called a trial period provision. If circumstances arose that made it difficult for you to immediately assume full control of the Foundation, you could choose to take on a probationary role for 1 year. What would that involve? You would receive a modest annual stipend rather than the full inheritance, and you would work as the Foundation's director under the oversight of a board of trustees chosen by Duke Edmund. At the end of the year, if your performance was satisfactory, you would receive the full inheritance. If not, or if you chose to withdraw, the assets would transfer to the estate. Isabella felt a spark of hope for the first time in days. So I could prove myself through my work rather than having to defend myself against gossip and accusations? Exactly. And during that probationary period, any legal challenges to your eventual inheritance would be suspended. Lord Fairfax couldn't file his petition because there would be nothing to contest yet. Alexander was nodding thoughtfully. It's actually brilliant. It gives Isabella a chance to demonstrate her capabilities while taking away Victoria's ammunition for legal challenges. But what about the newspaper stories and the social gossip? Isabella asked. People have short memories for scandal, Mr. Pemberton said pragmatically. If you focus on doing excellent work with the Foundation and avoid the social scene for a while, the gossip will eventually die down and be replaced by other stories. Isabella felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. This wasn't the path she had expected to take, but it offered her what she wanted most, the ability to continue Duke Edmund's work without having to constantly defend herself against personal attacks. There's one more thing, Mr. Pemberton added. Duke Edmund specified that if you chose this option, you would be required to leave Raven's Hollow Castle and establish your own residence. He felt it would be important for you to demonstrate your independence. Isabella glanced at Alexander, who looked troubled by this requirement. Where would I live? Rose Cottage was included in your original bequest, Mr. Pemberton reminded her. It's fully furnished and ready for occupancy. You could move there immediately. That would actually solve several problems, Isabella realized. I'd be away from the tension here at the castle, and it would make it clear that I'm not trying to maintain any inappropriate influence over the family. I don't like the idea of you being alone and isolated, Alexander said with concern. I wouldn't be isolated, Isabella replied, feeling more confident with each passing moment. Rose Cottage is only 5 miles from the village, and it's much closer to several of the Foundation's field offices. I could actually be more effective working from there. As the three of them discussed the details of the probationary arrangement, Isabella felt her spirits lifting for the first time in weeks. This path wouldn't be easy, but it offered her a chance to prove herself through her actions rather than having to defend herself against lies and insinuations. I want to do it, Isabella said firmly. I want to take the probationary appointment and move to Rose Cottage. Are you certain? Mr. Pemberton asked. Once we activate this provision, you can't change your mind and claim the full inheritance immediately. I'm certain, Isabella said. This is what Duke Edmund would have wanted, for me to earn my place through service, not through legal battles and social politics. Alexander reached over and took her hand. If this is what you want, then you have my complete support. And just because you won't be living at the castle doesn't mean you won't still be part of our family. Isabella squeezed his hand gratefully, feeling truly hopeful for the first time since the will reading. The next year would be the most important of her life, but she was ready for the challenge. She would prove to everyone, including herself, that Duke Edmund's faith in her had been justified. 1 year later, Isabella stood in the garden of Rose Cottage, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. The small estate had become more than just her home. It had become the headquarters of the most successful year in the Ravens Hollow Foundation's history. What had started as a desperate attempt to escape scandal had transformed into a period of incredible growth and achievement. The cottage itself was a charming stone building surrounded by carefully tended gardens that Isabella had expanded to include vegetable plots for the local food bank. She had converted the carriage house into offices for the Foundation's growing staff, and the guest quarters now housed visiting program directors and field workers from across the kingdom. This morning was special. It marked exactly 1 year since she had accepted the probationary appointment, and today the Board of Trustees would make their final decision about her permanent appointment as head of the Foundation. More importantly, today would determine whether Duke Edmund's faith in her had been justified. Isabella walked through the garden toward the cottage, mentally reviewing the accomplishments of the past 12 months. The Foundation had opened 3 new schools, established 2 additional medical clinics, and launched an innovative agricultural program that had increased crop yields in struggling farming communities by an average of 40%. They had also created a revolutionary job training initiative that had successfully placed over 200 unemployed workers in permanent positions. But the statistics, impressive as they were, didn't tell the whole story. Isabella had learned that true leadership meant more than just managing budgets and overseeing programs. It meant visiting remote villages to understand problems firsthand, listening to the people they served, and constantly adapting their approaches based on real-world results. As she entered the cottage's main office, Isabella found her assistant, Margaret Turner, already at work organizing files for the board meeting. Margaret was a young woman from the village who had started as a part-time clerk and had quickly proven herself to be invaluable. She had a sharp mind for organization and an intuitive understanding of the Foundation's mission. "Good morning, Lady Isabella," Margaret said cheerfully. "Everything is ready for the trustees' arrival. The financial reports, program evaluations, and beneficiary testimonials are all prepared." "Thank you, Margaret. I don't know what I would have done without you this year." "You would have managed perfectly well," Margaret replied with a smile. "Though I'm grateful you didn't have to. This has been the most meaningful work I've ever done." Isabella felt a warm glow of satisfaction. One of her proudest achievements had been building a team of dedicated people who shared her passion for helping others. The Foundation staff had grown from the original 47 employees to over 70, and every new hire had been chosen not just for their skills, but for their commitment to the mission. A knock at the front door interrupted her thoughts. Through the window, Isabella could see Prince Alexander approaching, accompanied by Mr. Pemberton and several other people she didn't immediately recognize. "The board has arrived," Margaret announced, straightening her dress nervously. Isabella took a deep breath and opened the door to greet them. Alexander smiled warmly at her, and she was struck once again by how much their relationship had strengthened over the past year. Without the tensions of living in the same household, they had been able to rebuild their friendship on more equal footing. "Good morning, Isabella," Alexander said formally, his tone reflecting the serious nature of the day's proceedings. "May I present the Board of Trustees?" Isabella had worked with these people throughout the year, but she had never seen them all together in one place. There was Dr. Elizabeth Carmichael, the kingdom's leading expert on rural health care, Professor James Morrison, who had revolutionized agricultural education, Lady Caroline Ashworth, a veteran philanthropist who managed several other charitable organizations, and Sir Robert Whitfield, a former Treasury official who specialized in foundation management. "Lady Isabella," Dr. Carmichael said warmly, "thank you for hosting us at your lovely cottage. We're all eager to discuss your remarkable achievements this year." They settled in the cottage's sitting room, which Isabella had arranged with comfortable chairs in a circle rather than the formal boardroom setup that might have been expected. She wanted this meeting to feel like a conversation among colleagues, rather than a formal examination. "Before we begin our official proceedings," Sir Robert said, pulling out a thick folder, "I want to commend you on the quality of your documentation. Your quarterly reports have been the most thorough and insightful I've seen in 30 years of foundation work." "Thank you," Isabella replied. "I've tried to be completely transparent about both our successes and our challenges." Speaking of challenges, Professor Morrison interjected, "We were particularly impressed by how you handled the situation in Millbrook County. When the original school construction ran into difficulties, many administrators would have simply canceled the project or blamed contractors. Instead, you redesigned the entire approach and created something even better than originally planned." Isabella smiled, remembering the crisis he was referring to. The foundation had committed to building a new school in a remote mountain community, but geological surveys had revealed that the chosen site was unsuitable for construction. Rather than abandoning the project, Isabella had worked with local leaders to create a mobile education program that served 3 small villages instead of just one. "That project taught me that flexibility can lead to better outcomes than rigid adherence to original plans," Isabella said. "The mobile school serves twice as many children as a traditional building would have, and it's become a model for other rural areas." Lady Caroline nodded approvingly. "That kind of innovative thinking is exactly what Duke Edmund hoped you would bring to the foundation. But innovation is only part of what we've been evaluating. What other factors have you considered?" Isabella asked, genuinely curious about their assessment process. Dr. Carmichael answered, "We've been looking at your leadership style, your financial management, your relationships with staff and beneficiaries, and your long-term vision for the foundation's future. We've also been paying attention to how you've handled the personal challenges you've faced," Sir Robert added meaningfully. Isabella knew he was referring to the scandal and gossip that had initially driven her to Rose Cottage. "I hope my focus on work rather than responding to attacks has demonstrated my priorities." "It has done more than that," Lady Caroline said. "Your dignified silence in the face of malicious rumors has actually enhanced the foundation's reputation. People have come to see you as someone who cares more about helping others than about defending herself." Alexander spoke up for the first time since the introductions. "There's something else the board should know. The gossip and newspaper stories that plagued Isabella a year ago have had an unexpected consequence. They've actually increased public awareness of the foundation's work." "How so?" Professor Morrison asked. "When people investigated the stories about Isabella, they also learned about all the good work the foundation does," Alexander explained. "Many of our new donors say they first heard about us through the controversy, but stayed because they were impressed by our programs." Isabella was surprised to hear this. She had been so focused on her work that she hadn't paid much attention to public perception over the past year. "That brings us to another important point," Dr. Carmichael said. Isabella, are you aware that several other charitable organizations have adopted program models based on your innovations this year? Isabella shook her head, genuinely surprised. The mobile education program, the integrated agricultural medical clinics, and your community-based job training model have all been replicated by foundations across the kingdom, Sir Robert explained. You've not only advanced Duke Edmund's mission, you've influenced the entire charitable sector. Isabella felt overwhelmed by this information. She had been so focused on serving the people in their programs that she hadn't realized her work was being noticed by others in the field. There's one more thing we need to discuss, Lady Caroline said, her expression becoming more serious. Your personal situation and future plans. What do you mean? A year ago, you were facing social ostracism and legal threats, Lady Caroline explained. Today, you're one of the most respected philanthropists in the kingdom. How do you plan to handle your new status? Isabella was quiet for a moment, considering the question carefully. I hope to handle it the same way I've approached everything else this year, by focusing on the work rather than on my personal position. That's an admirable sentiment, Professor Morrison said, but you'll need to be realistic about the fact that your influence has grown far beyond this foundation. Other organizations will want your involvement, government officials will seek your advice on policy, and you'll have opportunities to impact issues on a national scale. Are you prepared for that level of responsibility? Sir Robert asked directly. Isabella thought about Duke Edmund and the conversations they had shared about using privilege and resources to help others. I think I am. This year has taught me that real leadership isn't about personal power. It's about using whatever influence you have to serve others. The board members exchanged glances, and Isabella could see approval in their expressions. In that case, Dr. Carmichael said formally, "It's time for our official decision." Sir Robert stood up and pulled out an official-looking document. Lady Isabella Thornfield, the Board of Trustees of the Ravens Hollow Foundation has unanimously voted to confirm your appointment as permanent director and to recommend that you receive the full inheritance as specified in Duke Edmund's will. Isabella felt tears of relief and gratitude welling up in her eyes. Thank you, all of you. This year has been the most challenging and rewarding of my life. There's more, Alexander said with a smile. Mr. Pemberton has additional news. The elderly solicitor cleared his throat and pulled out another document. Lady Isabella, in addition to the inheritance you already know about, Duke Edmund included a provision that would only be activated if you successfully completed your probationary period. What kind of provision? An additional endowment of £5 million, specifically designated for expanding the Foundation's work internationally. Duke Edmund believed that if you proved yourself capable of managing the domestic operations, you should have the resources to help people beyond our kingdom's borders. Isabella was speechless. The scope of what Duke Edmund had entrusted to her was even greater than she had imagined. As the formal meeting concluded and the board members prepared to leave, Alexander lingered behind to speak with Isabella privately. "I have something to confess," he said once they were alone. "What's that?" "I wasn't entirely honest about how the gossip affected public perception of the Foundation." Isabella looked at him with concern. "What do you mean?" "I may have hired a publicity agent to help counter the negative stories," Alexander admitted sheepishly. "Someone who specialized in highlighting the Foundation's work whenever your name appeared in the newspapers." Isabella stared at him for a moment, then burst out laughing. "You manipulated the media?" "I prefer to think of it as strategic communication," Alexander said with mock dignity. "Besides, everything the agent publicized was completely true. I just made sure people heard about your accomplishments along with Victoria's gossip." "Speaking of Victoria, what's happened to her?" Alexander's expression grew more serious. "She's been living quietly at the London house. The scandal she tried to create ultimately reflected more poorly on her than on you. Most people came to see her as bitter and jealous rather than rightfully concerned." "I almost feel sorry for her," Isabella said, surprising herself. "She lost her husband, and then she felt like she was losing her place in the family, too. That's very generous of you, considering everything she put you through." Duke Edmund always said that forgiveness was more valuable to the person who gives it than to the person who receives it, Isabella replied. Besides, her attacks ultimately made me stronger and more determined. As evening approached, and Alexander prepared to return to Raven's Hollow Castle, Isabella walked him to his carriage. The gardens around Rose Cottage were in full bloom, and the air was filled with the scent of roses and jasmine. "Will you move back to the castle now?" Alexander asked. "You're welcome anytime, you know." Isabella looked back at the cottage that had become so much more than just a home. "I think I'll stay here, at least for now. This place has become the heart of the Foundation's work, and I've grown to love the independence it represents. What about the future? Do you ever think about marriage, about having a family of your own?" Isabella smiled. "I have a family, everyone whose lives we touch through the Foundation's work. As for marriage, well, I suppose I'll have to find someone who shares my passion for helping others. Anyone who couldn't understand that wouldn't be right for me anyway." As Alexander's carriage disappeared down the lane, Isabella stood in her garden watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. A year ago, she had felt like her world was ending. Tonight, she felt like her real life was just beginning. Duke Edmund had left her more than money and responsibility. He had given her the opportunity to discover who she really was and what she was capable of achieving. The scared young woman who had fled to Rose Cottage had been replaced by a confident leader who knew her own worth and her own mission. Isabella walked back toward the cottage, already making mental plans for the international programs that the additional endowment would make possible. There were schools to be built, medical clinics to be established, and countless lives to be improved. The work would never end, but that was exactly how she wanted it to be. Inside the cottage, Margaret had left a stack of letters from beneficiaries expressing gratitude for the Foundation's help. Isabella read through them one by one, each story reminding her of why Duke Edmund's faith in her had been so precious and why she had been right to fight for the chance to honor his legacy. As she prepared for bed, Isabella caught sight of her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at her was poised, confident, and at peace with herself. She had faced the test of fire and emerged stronger than she had ever imagined possible. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to serve others. But tonight, Isabella simply felt grateful for Duke Edmund's wisdom, for Alexander's friendship, for the dedicated staff who shared her mission, and for the chance to spend her life making the world a better place for those who needed help most. The Hidden Will had exposed more than just Duke Edmund's final wishes. It had revealed Isabella's true character and her capacity for leadership, compassion, and grace under pressure. She had been chosen not because she was perfect, but because she had the heart to serve others and the strength to persevere when serving became difficult. In the end, that had been Duke Edmund's greatest gift to her. Not the money or the position, but the opportunity to become the person she was always meant to be.